Nobody leave. What are you doing? Hello, so my name is Ben Makuch. I'm a national security reporter. I kind of want to start this off by saying some background on me. I used to host this show called Cyber War. I remember at the time, people used to say, that name is kind of a little insane. It's a little over the top. But now, you look at it in 2023, and it's really become something that is a common topic, a common term. At the time, we were looking at stuff like ICS attacks, attacks on companies, exfiltrating data, and really a lot of the time people thought, how is this ever going to look in a real war? And of course, now we have that example, and it looks a little bit like we thought and a little bit not like we thought. And it also concerns private companies as much as it concerns governments. So with that, I would like to invite the speakers on stage, Sorin Ducaru, Melissa Hathaway, Andrew Lee, and Clint Watts.
Sorin, you're supposed to be here.
I'll take whatever's last.
Okay.
So, Clint, I kind of want to start with you because obviously Microsoft has played a huge role in protecting Ukraine. So, can you kind of walk me through how Microsoft got involved and what it's seen at the early set of the war and what it looks like now?
Yeah, so it's fascinating. I don't think anyone thought when a cyber war is about to kick off, it will be the technology companies that come on board. And so, I'll talk about Microsoft's experience, but there are lots of others out here as well. Google's here, AWS, everyone's really chipped in. And so what we started to see immediately were cyber attacks before the war started, which is always what we thought we'd see, phase zero warfare, cyber attacks leading into an invasion. And I think that's when Microsoft and many others stepped up and said, hey, we need to do some backing up of your systems right now. We got to get you to the cloud. So that was really the first step of it. Second part of that was how do we put our cybersecurity teams in place, get all of our systems up to speed to protect that data, become resilient. And I think that's where the Microsoft Threat Intelligence Center, which I work with all the time, my team, the Digital Threat Analysis Center, Microsoft Threat Intelligence Center, we worked together, but what they did was they immediately started identifying the signatures of new types of malware that were being deployed. The first shots in the war were not actual shots. They were cyber attacks that were being directed, and it was malware that was the payload. That was really the weapon that was being used. And so being able to patch those sorts of things very quickly, send out all sorts of alerts, not just inside Ukraine, but around the world, because as we know, these weapons, once they're fired, can be picked up and used by somebody else when it comes to malware. I think the next thing that we saw is building that enduring presence. And so when we look at it now, there's really, right before the war, the initial phase of the war, which goes up to the point where the failed Russian assault to Kyiv really was turned around. The next phase was the focus on the Donbass. The third phase was the counteroffensives of the Ukrainians, and then really looking at what's going on this year. And you've seen remarkable change through that, but I think the one consistency of it is Microsoft being there in the cloud, being there with cybersecurity, and with my team, really analyzing the influence efforts that the Russians have been trying to use inside Ukraine and really in broader Europe.
So there has been ICS attacks as well as influence operations. And I'm curious, was Microsoft involved at all in 2014 onwards? Was it monitoring things then as well?
Monitoring things, but not present in the same way. I think that's the way to sort of think about it. If you look at this 10-year evolution in cybersecurity, a lot has changed, right? You had the Microsoft Threat Intelligence Center really building up because everyone realized, and I realized it right then, about 2012, I came out of the FBI and worked at a cybersecurity fusion center, worked with the financial industry, that it wasn't simply enough to just react and try and patch and restore systems. Instead, we needed threat intelligence that really told us where to look to. And you saw the development of cybersecurity fusion centers across the board, and then you saw the development of information security associations, ISACs, around the world by industry. And now what you're seeing increasingly is that sort of affiliation association where the public-private sector partnerships are really the facilitation mechanism for cybersecurity for everyone. So that 10-year evolution, I think Microsoft has been there every step of the way in terms of doing the detection, the patching, loading things into Defender, Microsoft's threat intelligence community as a whole, everything that we're producing. That's a 10-year evolution. It's grown because of the nature of the threat, but it's also grown in the nature of the defense, which has really changed.
And obviously there's been a lot of information sharing a lot of threat assessment. People who are actually companies are working together, and obviously ESET has had a huge role in this war, and right from the beginning. So, Andrew, tell me a little bit about that. How did ESET react to it?
So I think it was for us a very natural thing. I mean, the border is 384 kilometers away, right? So Ukraine is very close to us geographically, personally. Very many of our colleagues are Ukrainian themselves, or they have Ukrainian family, our friends, and so on. So that was a very natural thing to be involved. But the other thing is, because of our historic geographical location as a European cybersecurity company, I think we already did have a long-standing relationship with Ukraine. We knew the right people to be able to contact, to be able to work with them. And we were able to, we've been present in Ukraine for a very long time, working on these threats. He said a lot of research in, for instance, early black energy in 2015, and Indestroyer 2016, NotPetya, and so on and so on. So we'd been there, they knew us. And I think the key to it was that there was a trusted relationship there. And I think also one of the things that really sort of happened very early on was as Clint's already said, there were a lot of people starting to look at what happens. And so, Microsoft were already very present, working on some of those things, and actually those early wipers that came out, the Hermetic wiper, Caddy wiper, and so on, the Hermetic wiper actually struck the day before the full-scale invasion in the kinetic sense. And actually the kind of the damage was somewhat limited, or at least isolated to certain areas, because we already had that trusted relationship. So, with information, working with Microsoft, working with ESET, we were able to really sort of react very quickly to those type of threats, and saw what was happening, and were able to respond, in very, very short time scales. And so I think that's really been the power of the sort of, the reaction was there, but it wasn't a reaction like suddenly, oh my goodness, what do we do? It was like, okay, this is what we've been planning for. This is why we've been building trust. This is why we've been working together. Let's do something. And now we could, we could just react.
And that is something. There's been a lot of headlines about this. That, why haven't we seen the widespread attacks, or why haven't we seen the power grids knocked out completely, or sort of the Gucci attacks, so to speak? Why has that been the case?
I don't know, but we can speculate. There's been a lot of discussion about what Russia thought they were going to achieve very quickly in the first weeks of the war, and there were significant attacks, but they were mostly aimed at trying to disrupt and perhaps just stop the Ukrainians being effective in running their government, in being able to communicate properly. And because I think Russia really thought that they would achieve their military aims very quickly, the cyber was kind of a backup. And then we did see the Indestroyer 2 attack in April last year, somewhere around there. And that was another large-scale attempt to take out the power grid, an attack on the Ukrainian power systems. And again, it came down to the fact that Ukraine has spent 10 years building its cyber resilience. We did have a partnership of information sharing between private companies, but also between the CERT community, that Ukraine was getting information from other CERTs and other information from other places, and that led to being able to stop those attacks happening. Added to which, there was a certain sloppiness to some of the operations that Russia undertook, to be completely frank.
That gets me to a point of, there was a lot of NATO training, even in the east of the country, for soldiers. So obviously there was the same going on in cyber. And I'm wondering, Sorin, when you were there, you said something like that there was a sense of denial among nation states in NATO, that they hadn't been preparing enough for what was to come. And I'm wondering, has that changed? Do you think that NATO has gotten the message since the war in Ukraine to take cyber more seriously?
To be fair, NATO has evolved significantly, actually, since 2007, the Web War I, attack against Estonia. when NATO decided to address cybersecurity in strategic and policy terms, not just as a technical issue to be, left in the hands of the technicians. So since then, there has been a significant evolution. But I do, I can vouch the fact that the 2014, actually the illegal annexation and illegitimate annexation of Crimea and the whole cyber warfare around it, and what happened actually the year after, 2015, the attack against the energy grid of Ukraine, all these generated two aspects. Yes, it was a strong evidence that cyber attacks can be strategic, and let's not forget, it was after the annexation of Crimea that NATO just, this was in spring 2014, and then at the Will Summit in September, NATO links cyber defense with collective defense. It really determined that these kind of attacks can reach a threshold where they can be as damaging as conventional attack. Therefore, it's legitimate to invoke potentially Article 5, and there was a new cyber defense policy that NATO elaborated with also a number of concrete actions taken, the development of a dedicated partnership with industry on cyber, other than the procurement old partnership that NATO had, much more interlinked with what the companies are doing. And I fully agree that the early warning comes actually from industry, always better. Secondly, strengthening the information exchange, developing rapid reaction, cyber specialist teams, and last but not least, developing a special partnership with Ukraine. To be honest, one of the reasons why we have not seen so much damage on the cyber front is also the fact that Ukrainians have become much more resilient in this almost 10 years. I know the reform in the institutions. I know the kind of specialists that are involved, and somehow from becoming a kind of cyber shooting range, because it was a shooting range that everyone could watch and learn from, Ukraine proved to be quite resilient, and also with the support of all the partnership that it has been has created. So that's a good lesson learned. I mean, if you ask me if there's much more to do, absolutely. But I think we are in a clearly different strategic moment right now, and I think the next phases have to, beyond strengthen resilience, and both at NATO level, EU level, we have a new Cyber Resilience Act that the Commission launched just in April. So all these are excellent developments. I think we need to think a bit beyond this, of especially how to be able to inhibit in advance and potentially even deter the kind of impunity of like cyber attacks, especially those that would be below the threshold of what would be considered an armed attack. And here the debate is ongoing. And then, of course, we need to develop a better norms of responsible behavior rules to establish a bit of more predictability and the kind of community of rules-abiding nations, and this is an effort that governments have to do in conjunction with the private sector, with academia. This is what would be called a multi-stakeholder approach, which is important.
Which, if you look at something like Stuxnet, which was, I think it was 2008 or something, 2007. This was obviously something, I remember it's been described to me by people who were involved with it, that we could use, an airplane to strike this plant, or we could use cyber. But it eventually essentially did the same thing, except through code. Now, it's still the same type of attack. And now, since this war has began, there is, as Melissa has reminded us in an email chain, there's been a list of attacks that have happened in not Ukraine and in NATO countries and Western democracies. So, want to tell me a little bit about this list of? There's so many. There's the pipeline in Canada apparently, which was part of the Pentagon leaks, but there's been others.
Yeah, there's been so many. It's hard to report on all of them, but and I think it's really important that there's a lot of proxies being used by the Russian government, the ransomware gangs, whether it's DarkSide, Black Cat, the Black Energy, etc. There's lots of different groups, etc. So you could take it to SolarWinds, which was a significant compromise of software that was used by more than 400 of the Fortune 500. The Russians were able to get it inside the code and manipulate it, similar to DocME, which is what they did with NotPetya. All of those companies who ingested that had basically became a target, or could be. There were a number of companies who lost their code along with that, a lot of the IT industry. So that would be the beginning, and that was pre-invasion. That was when it was discovered. It was December of 21. We had Colonial Pipeline, which was DarkSide, which showed again pre-invasion, again in 21, that showed that you could create a national crisis in the United States in less than 6 days with one company by knocking them offline and ransom them. We had the acid rain wiper virus that took out Viasat. That was all the command and control in Ukraine. That was the day before the invasion. Same day or the next day, you had NVIDIA. All of their code was stolen and then posted. NVIDIA is important for GPUs and for ransomware payments and Bitcoin harvesting, etc. Then you can go down the line. You've seen Enercon, all the alternative energy. In Europe, you saw Netherlands, Norway, Germany, Denmark. I think it's 14 out of the NATO countries have all experienced some type of malicious activity, disruption, and some destructive activity. There was a liquid natural gas facility in the United States that was blown up and knocked offline for more than 7 months. One could attribute that to an industrial control system failure and weapon. And then most recently, through the Pentagon leaks, the discussion about the pipelines in Canada. These are not insignificant events. And the malicious activity is just, in quote, at least our countries want to say it's below the threshold of armed attack. But somewhere we're in a very gray zone of what that armed attack is. When you take off command and control and Viasat and knock off energy in multiple countries, that sits on a very interesting threshold that if we're at a tipping point of miscalculation and escalation, that will bring in a lot more countries into this. And we're 20 wiper viruses in just this calendar year of new wipers. So wiper viruses are malicious software that destroy your equipment, not just disable it. So the Russians have because they stole the code of a lot of companies' software, they've been able to create very good tailored weapons against those different types of systems.
So why don't you think there's been any real response to this? Because obviously Sorin mentioned Article 5. These are clearly, to some extent, you could argue kinetic attacks on countries that could invoke Article 5. Why hasn't that happened, do you think? It's not a government target, it's companies. So it's still part of, our society, our culture. We need that. There's a huge financial penalty to it for whoever is targeted. Why haven't?
Well, the Killnet Collective, which is Russian, they've gone after the Italian government. They went after the Canadian government. So there are governments that are actually being attacked and knocked offline.
But why haven't governments looked at this more
There is
seriously?
a lack of political will and appetite to join the war. When you put another human being across the border, you are now effectively expanded the region of the war zone, and then anything goes. And all of our governments and our countries are trying to do everything short of sending a human being and committing themselves. So give them much money as possible. Certainly the United States has given the most, as much weapons as possible. But to put a human being on the ground would be considered we've entered the war.
And that's not something, obviously, NATO's prepared to do just yet. What about the relationship, and I'd like to kind of put this to the group, what do you think is an ideal relationship between the government and the private sector right now, going forward? Is it something that's more hands-on, or is it letting the private sector do what it's doing right now, which is, I think Andrew has mentioned to me, has changed a little bit?
Yeah, I think things have changed somewhat. You know, like I've been doing this for a long, long time, and I've probably throughout those 20, 30 years heard time and time again, information sharing, share more information. You know, I think that has been an ongoing trend. There has been more information sharing. I think one of the things that has been highlighted was the differences now than what was traditionally in the past the domain of the intelligence services, which was the amount of data held by different entities. So now the data intelligence, the threat intelligence, the malware intelligence is held by companies that are in the private sector, not by militaries, by intelligence agencies, to a great degree. So where I think there has been this kind of overlap of kind of usefulness to each other has been in that information sharing zone, where we're able to provide real-time threat data to agencies who they go upstream and look for the actors. And to some degree, you know, there's a level of correlation and, you know, analysis that we can do that will allow for some attribution, that will allow for at least a faster processing of that data, of where we think it came from, who it's related to, whether the code looks like it's, you know, Sandworm or it's Cameradon or it's whoever, you know, whichever, you know, threat actor is behind it. But I think one of the things that has become clear was that the political will, the outrage in the public sphere, and the willingness of the tech industry to really become very deeply involved in helping Ukraine, as Melissa said, you know, throwing as much as we can at the problem, whether that's information, whether that's data help, or whether it's infrastructure, or whether it's weaponry or whatever. There has been a lot of involvement. I think where we look going forward is how does that look long term on two fronts. First of all, how far do you go down that route of where the government starts to expect that private companies become an adjunct arm of their defense services? That's something that worries me. And secondly, how far do you go down the mandating information sharing which crosses over the threshold of commercial interests of private companies? So, you know, if when Russia withdraws and Ukraine reclaims its territory, what does it look like a year after that? Are the private companies still providing all of the infrastructure, all of the services, all of the you know, the support for free, or is there some kind of way that starts to be compensated? So these are things I think I don't have strong, firm answers for, but I think these are things that we need to start thinking about as to what does this look like going forward.
Is there a chance where like oversharing could happen? Is that, do you think that's already happening?
Oversharing, I'm not sure this would be the right term. I mean, information is, you know, is data. I think oversharing in the sense that if, you know, I've seen occasionally things come up in forum where, you know, it would be great if all the companies shared all their data with whoever, and you're like, well, hang on a second. The reason governments don't do this is because it's really, really expensive to do it. And the private sector does it and sells it so that it can support doing it. And so if you start mandating, say, right, everyone shares everything into central authority, whatever that authority looks like, I think that's when you start to get these kind of conflicts between commerciality and sort of and security of the nation state. So I think there's a balance there, of course, and I think we need to have that conversation, but we do need to have that conversation.
because of course you don't want to be in a situation where the government is inhibiting the private sector, because I think clearly the private sector has been better at innovating and coming up with information. I mean, if you look at something like 0 days and their incredible usefulness to intelligence agencies, most of these are being found by companies. And let's say the FBI or the NSA can get hold of them, or other European agencies. I mean, if you started to try to control these companies, that might not happen. I mean, what do you think, Clint?
Well, I am at a company and not in the government anymore. That's your answer.
Yeah.
I think when you get to the bottom of it, I'm going to go 20 years here. I was a 9/11 hire to the FBI as an FBI agent, and now I'm at Microsoft. Never did I think that would be, the route 20 years ago. But in everything that I do, I have better understanding, I have a better data, I have better perspective on the threats that I am concerned about. Cyber used to be terrorism with Al-Qaeda and ISIS, open source in terms of nation states now, understanding psychological dimensions, the rise of AI, all of these things are happening in the private sector. All threat actors are going to those tools to do those things. If I were at the FBI or any of the government agencies, my view would be really, really narrow. It would be very difficult to understand those things. And so I have great joy in laughing at my former government friends, right? Because their view is extremely limited on some things. Now, they do understand things like intention, which we would never know, in the private sector, nor should we worry, to some extent about that. But what we can do is really provide a rich understanding of all threats, all methods, all actors after, they've been attributed around the world. And that is beneficial for everybody. 10 years ago, when I first went to a bank, we were starting information sharing with the government, and we were doing all the sharing, and the government didn't have anything to share with us. I don't know how it was for everybody else, but they didn't, and I knew that because I come from the government. We didn't know. All the attacks are happening in .com. They're happening in .edu. They're happening in .org. Yeah, sure, .gov.mil are being struck too, but they're a very small part of the ocean of targets. And so if you really understand the nature of warfare, if you look at satellites being attacked, those aren't government satellites necessarily anymore. A lot of them are commercial satellites. You look at any of these things technologically, it requires an understanding of what's going on in the private sector. And at the same point, what are those authorities? Depending on the regulatory environment, when you go around the world, it's give us everything and put it in a giant data pile, and then we're going to do something with it, maybe, right? Also, aid your enemies if it's publicly disclosed in a way, right? So there's obvious data protections that need to be there. What's the right amount of privacy? I think at Microsoft we focus on that very heavily. And then I think the other part is what is the government's role? What I see oftentimes with governments is they're confused at this point, and they're not sure what they should be doing. I will hear them say, well, we need more data. I'm like, well, maybe you just need to understand the data. You don't need more data necessarily, because there should be rightful boundaries in each of those environments around what stays with the company, what stays with users and customers, and then what the government needs it for and why.
And that's a question I had, was the government role, because you look at something like, and I've mentioned to all of you, Starlink. This incredibly useful tool that the Ukrainian government and Ukrainian people have been a part or have been using, that without it, the information war that I think Ukraine is to some extent winning probably wasn't going to be possible. But at the same time, this thing is also controlled and at the whim of Elon Musk, who I think, regardless of how you think of his politics, can be an erratic person that might just shut off access to it. So how do you think, Sorin, the government might be able to balance that to make sure that the private sector doesn't have too much power on some of these tools?
Well, I think the first thing that will happen, and in a way is happening, is the fact that you gave the example of space assets. There is a democratization of access to space assets, and there will be actually more competition. Starlink will not be the only constellation, maybe not even the only American constellation, but about European plans announced by Commissioner Breton of launching also equivalent constellation. Of course, Chinese are thinking about this themselves. So from one point of view, it's the market and the kind of more extensive use of space in this case. I in one of the conferences that I've been in, one of the discussions, somebody was talking of something like a Ford era beginning for space, like like it was Henry Ford for automobiles, standardizing and then building equipment at that scale and so on. So that's one. I think the customers will be interested to rely on the services on someone who is or company of his that is reliable. If you look at Elon Musk, some might put some of the tweets and so on, or link them to tantrums and so on. But on the other hand, one should consider that there were real threats to Starlink that have been made by Russian officials. And let's not forget that few months before the war started, Russia had an anti-satellite test. It shot of one of his own old satellites just to show that it can, and and it was in low orbit, and send the message, okay, we can do it. So the threats are not empty threats. So what the government can and should do is to make sure that these kinds of threats are discouraged. I, for one, believe that things like anti-satellite tests or any kind of actions should be banned. That should be the first step into making outer space this time more resilient and better service. And secondly, and that's linked also to developing some rules of the road, both for cyberspace, and since you brought up the satellite domain, outer space as well. These are two spaces where the normal rules of the roads that we use in land, air, sea cannot be applied exactly the same. You cannot apply the same arms control regime and so on. So this is where governments, but not alone, in partnership with industry, can and should play a bigger role.
I have a Slido question here, and also everyone, if you'd like to get in on that, I think you can just log in and I'll ask the question. One from Lucas Lavica from Introsec. How, with regards to attribution, avoid the risk of false flag operations? It is relatively easy to perform this kind of operation, is known to happen. What is the right amount of sure-to-be attribute attacker when it could pose a war initiation?
Yeah, I mean, I think that false flag operations happen all the time. And this is where sort of the early warning that is given by a Microsoft or an ESET or Google, pick your threat intelligence, that's picking up hands off to the government, and the government needs to work through their respective intelligence, military, law enforcement services in order to get to that true attribution. While corporations do some attribution, you could never be, it's actually not really effective until the government decides that they're going to attribute and there'll be some consequence. And I think that is, and when you get to the role of the private-public partnership, I don't ever think of it as a public-private partnership. Just as Clint said, the government doesn't ever share very much information. So it's usually a one-way street. But if you think of it as a tip and cue of the early warning from the private sector who's sitting on the networks, and then they cue it back to the government to get to that, then you can get to what I would think is now the 21st century sensor to shooter. The sensors are on the networks, they're detecting this anomalous behavior, they send it back to queue to the government. The government can in fact take an action, or an action can be taken inside the network. And so I think that is important. To Sorin's point, and actually builds on Andrew's point, the Elon Musk thing, at the end of the day, these are all for-profit companies. And there's only so many services you can provide for free. and Microsoft, ESET. There are a lot of companies providing a lot of free services right now, and that can only go so long. So if we're printing billions of dollars and we're sending it to Ukraine, some fraction of that should be going to pay for some of these services to these corporations who are keeping Ukraine resilient. And so I wouldn't put it behind. Elon, there's only so much you can do. That's going to be I'm gonna continue to eat my bottom line for the good of humanity. It doesn't work. Yeah. That shareholders don't exactly care for that very much. So at the end of the day, if he pulled the plug because of funding, then the Pentagon or somebody else needs to start paying the bills. And I think that when you look at the long term, going to place just one more thing on the table. When you look at the long term of, do you expect this free for service as we're rebuilding? No. But we also have to anticipate that when we have reconstruction of Ukraine, China wants to be there first, South Korea is there second, and where are we on the Western that have actually provided all of the capabilities today to Ukraine? And so we have to really think about what that reconstruction looks like, the rebuilding of their telecom, the rebuilding of their core infrastructures, and who are going to be the national champions to deliver that. Because right now, I think the West is behind.
And obviously, there's way more of an interest for the West to have them do it than China.
Yeah, I think this is one of the just to sort of pivot off that a little bit, one of the things that we've started to see, and I'm sure others have seen the same, is that we've started to see China become active, some of the Chinese threat actor groups pivoting from Asia, Southeast Asia, into looking in Ukraine. And clearly it's very beneficial for them to know what's been destroyed, what needs to be rebuilt, what kind of things were attacked. Clearly that's going to be of interest to them. And so coming back to the point before, how do we know it's China? Well, there are a lot of things that go into attribution, and yes, there absolutely are a lot of false flags. And this is one of the things where I think there's different comfort levels in different parts of the technology sector. For us, to some degree, attribution in the public sphere should be led by nation states, in my opinion. If the FBI comes out and says, we have an indictment against these 5 people from this Chinese branch of the PLA.
Which they do often.
Which they do. We will then say, if we see something from that known group, and we can attribute it to that group, we will say this is a Chinese-speaking actor that probably is associated with these people who the FBI have indicted for so-and-so. It's not our role, I think, to say these attacks that happened here were done by Iran, and this is the fact. I don't think that's us. Some tech companies may be more comfortable with that. They may even have more visibility. That's the other thing. I think it does fall where Melissa said, is you provide the information, and internally you can provide that attribution. You can say, we've seen all of these. It correlates with all of this stuff. We think this is probably a Chinese-speaking actor. This is Iran. This is whoever, DPRK. And you pass that up, and the people who go upstream are going to be the people who take care of that. We're not law enforcement. We're not military, we're not an intelligence agency, we're a software company. And Clint alluded to this earlier. It's like, in a sense, it doesn't matter. I don't care if China wrote it or Russia wrote it. From a code point of view, when we look at it and the analysts take a look and say, is this malicious or not? That's a very binary thing. It's like, yeah, this is malicious. Then you can do some further analysis to say, yeah, we think it's part of this group. They were targeting this. Here's the victimology. Here's how they moved laterally. Here's the data. Give that to whoever is going to take care of that upstream, and that's where I think our responsibility kind of ends. And then in the future you can publish, and there have been cases where we publish things, the FBI has come back to us and said, great, thanks for that, we got these guys, we arrested them, they're in prison, and now you can publish that you did this. And that's I think how that kind of piece works.
Just to make a point to that question that was kind of hinting a worry that some wrong attribution might lead to some act of war and so on. I can tell you that from my experience in NATO, I've never seen a rush towards attribution and then take action based on rushed attribution. Actually, to the contrary, super caution. The other point is that there's a lot that can be gained from analysis, especially from the private sector, IT system and so on, that would lead to quite good kind of attribution in a short time, let's say, significant confidence. But at state level and international organization level, this kind of quite relevant level of confidence is actually enhanced by linking, I would say, signals intelligence with the human intelligence, and then it reaches the real high confidence, and only then you see governments, or sometimes alone, sometimes in groups, coming out politically and pointing fingers and having the political attribution. So this is taken very serious. I remember sometime there was the famous it was called Cyber Caliphate attack against France 24, which proved in the end to have nothing to do with any caliphate, but was still Russian false flag cyber operation. But it didn't took too long to come to this conclusion and actually not be cheated by this false flag approach.
Actually, we have we have a really good example of that very, very recently. And this actually comes back to what Sorin was saying about the thresholds of rising to Article 5, possibly. There were severe attacks in Albania and Montenegro, both NATO members, very severe attacks. First of all, there was public, very quick attribution, say, oh, this is Russia. Then the Cuba group took, responsibility and say, oh, no, we did it. And ANSI and FBI went in and they investigated, and eventually it came out who it really was, that it was Iran. You have to be really very, very careful about this, and this is why NATO is so very careful about these discussions about where do we really attribute this to. And this is the problem with exactly that. In the fog of war, you shouldn't make these kind of decisions, especially when it can rise to this level of an Article 5. Sorry,
so, no, I'll just build on that. I mean, one of the challenges, though, is that even though we are attributing, it's not deterring any of the activity. That's right. Because there are no consequences right now. And so even the threat of consequences are very shallow. And so we're just seeing, actually, I think, just continue to escalate of, okay, you just told me I was bad. Who cares? Mm-hmm. I'm going to go after the next company and the next hospital and the next province and, the next satellite. There's no consequences.
The way I see it, it's just a bunch of guys in Russia or China who just can't travel to NATO countries anymore. Like that's the outcome.
All depends on where I might be able to go to Malta.
One final question. I'm going to take it from Slido, and I think it's a good one to end on. Are we heading to fight a multilateral cyber attack war run by various AI operators?
I'm not sure I would call it AI operators, but AI is absolutely coming into, we're going to have automated attacks. We're going to have new variants of malicious software and wiper viruses that are all going to be generated by AI on the fly. And so we're going to have to adapt to the speed and scale of these tools being used as weapons of war.
Can I add?
I was about to say, Clint, you gotta.
So, with AI, we cover both influence and cyber with my team, and immediately there was talk of a doomsday about 18 months ago. There were going to be tons of harms done because this new technology came out called the metaverse. I don't know if you heard about it, but it overtook the whole planet. I gotta say. So, I would also note that the best way to detect AI is to use AI. Right. The best way to detect humans is to use humans. My team's already working with the AI tools to see how is disinformation made. We're already bringing Copilot, AI for security into Microsoft. We're using it aggressively to try and do those detections. So I think the key point of all of it is, Brad Smith, my boss, will always say it's a tool or a weapon, and we need to figure out how do we make sure these tools stay as tools and not be used as weapons. And so that's our big focus of it. But our entire emphasis right now is how do we use AI to augment our analysts in terms of everything they do, from production to detection, but also in terms of how do we set up these systems. And so I'll give you one final story to close this out. Was everybody was worried that AI was going to be used for students to write their homework papers and take their test, right? My intern from 2 years ago, in one weekend, used ChatGPT to create a system to detect it in 48 hours. So I think the new generation that's coming on, if we focus on training and learning with AI, we're going to have just as many solutions oftentimes to do a lot of this detection. I agree that there's going to be tons of variants. You can make lots of disinformation, but you can't make people read it. That's something else I would add to this, having come from an influence background. There's going to be lots of things with this, and I think the key point is embedding AI for where AI is very good. And AI is very good for detection.
So we have time for one last question from the floor. Go for it. Where is the mic, actually? Well, if you could use your voice then. Will you hear me? Yeah. Okay.
Here comes the mic.
Oh, here comes the mic.
Oh, thanks. Okay, you can hear me now.
I hear you now.
Okay, I have 3 points, and then I'll be interested in any kind of reaction from the panel speakers. Point number 1, how we communicate inside of public institutions.
Just, if you can, just keep it to one question, just we're running out of time.
Okay. 1. Okay, so during the last decade or 2 decades or 3 decades, there has been a strong trend towards digitalization of how we communicate inside public institutions. My question is, maybe in some areas, should we go back to paper? If you have a sensitive information and there's a colleague sitting 10 meters away from you, maybe you don't need to send an email through all sorts of servers. Maybe we could go back to like typewriters.
Analog.
For some kind of, and have different levels of information. Very sensitive, you go for typewriter. Less sensitive, a computer that's not connected to networks, you print it out, you carry it. You have meetings that are personal instead of emails. What do you think about this kind of idea?
I think we're more.
This is happening.
I was going to say it's a U.S. intelligence community.
This is how it
experience.
Yeah. This is how it works. When there are super sensitive issues, someone takes the plane and goes and sees one person. It's just 2 persons having this communication. There's still kind of written messages that are delivered on different means than through servers and so on. So it's happening, but to communicate at scale, we need to rely on.
This is the Al-Qaeda problem. I mean, there was tons of little pieces of paper written down about 9/11 attackers that never got linked together because there wasn't information sharing. So there's always a delicate balance of that. I think it's usually intention, strategy, strategic principles, those things, why have those so widespread? But I think in most, even businesses, everything from businesses in terms of their most prized IP to, when you look at governments, how they try and control precious information, most of that triage system has been there. I say that, a reminder, a U.S. serviceman just took something out of a secret facility not 3 weeks ago, right, that was on paper and then uploaded it into the internet. So there's always weaknesses and strengths with all these approaches. But I agree to your point with scale. The FBI, CIA in the United States 20 years ago missed the 9/11 attacks because it couldn't synchronize and communicate at scale.
A lot of things never hit paper either. That's, and actually, in a sense, there are very few things that actually require person-to-person, no paper talking. And one of those things, which may be eventually solved by some systems, there's a lot of advances in quantum technology, that is key exchange for public encryption infrastructure. You better know that person is the right person who has the key at the other end, and they're the only person. That's really where a lot of the those kind of things, and an in-person briefing, as has been said, is ultimately like, yes, this doesn't leave this room, and it's never written down. Other than that, in my opinion, well encrypted, validated, secure systems are way more secure than pieces of paper in many cases, and way more useful from a computational point of view.
Mm-hmm.
And there's always that anecdote about Vladimir Putin doing most of his key decisions like 8 feet below or 8 stories below the Kremlin. So there's a lot of this stuff that's already playing out. And with that, I'm introducing the next panel, which is, I've been wanting to say this because it's kind of funny. Regime change in Russia. Really? Really? And with that, thank you very much for being here. And thank all the panelists.